The dawn broke over the North Sea on June 8, 793, revealing a horizon empty of mercy. The monks of Lindisfarne, an island monastery off the Northumbrian coast, had risen for their morning prayers, unaware that the liturgical calendar was about to be rewritten in blood. The Viking Age did not announce itself with diplomatic envoys or formal declarations. It arrived as 3 longships materializing from the sea mist, their dragon-head prows cutting through the surf like the fingers of a closing fist. This was not merely a raid. It was the inaugural strike of a military phenomenon that would reconfigure the entire strategic architecture of medieval Europe. The Lindisfarne attack represented the collision of 2 incompatible worlds: the settled, agrarian Christianity of Western Europe and the maritime raiding culture of Scandinavia. The tactical asymmetry was absolute. The monks possessed neither the defensive infrastructure nor the military doctrine to counter an amphibious assault executed with such brutal efficiency. The Viking operational method was elegance distilled to its lethal essence. The longships, shallow, drafted vessels capable of navigating both open ocean and inland rivers, functioned as the ultimate force projection platform of the early medieval period. With a draft of less than 3 feet when fully loaded, these vessels could beach directly onto shorelines, transforming any stretch of coast into a potential landing zone. The tactical advantage was revolutionary. While European armies relied on predictable overland routes and seasonal campaign windows, the Northmen operated across the maritime domain with a freedom that rendered traditional defensive planning obsolete. The human element of these early raids deserves surgical examination. The warriors who disembarked at Lindisfarne were not the mythologized berserkers of later legend, but rather professional raiders executing a calculated economic operation. The target selection itself demonstrated sophisticated intelligence gathering. Monasteries represented concentrated wealth, precious metals, ecclesiastical treasures, and stockpiles of grain defended by populations with no military capability. The risk-to-reward calculus was overwhelmingly favorable. The psychological impact of Lindisfarne reverberated across Christendom with the force of a seismic event. The scholar Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne, described the attack as an omen of civilizational collapse. His letter to King Alfred of Northumbria captured the existential dread that would characterize European responses for generations. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. This was more than religious horror. It was the recognition that the defensive assumptions undergirding European society had been rendered invalid. The immediate aftermath saw a recalibration of threat assessment across the British Isles. Lindisfarne was not an isolated incident, but the opening movement of a sustained campaign. The monasteries of Jarrow and Monkwearmouth fell within months. By 795, the Vikings had extended operations to Ireland, striking the island of Lambay near Dublin. The pattern was consistent: lightning strikes against coastal and riverine targets, maximum extraction of portable wealth, immediate withdrawal before any coordinated military response could materialize. The early Viking raids functioned as a form of asymmetric economic warfare. The strategic calculus was rooted in the geographic realities of Scandinavia itself. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden possessed limited arable land capable of supporting their expanding populations. Primogeniture inheritance systems meant that younger sons faced diminished prospects. The raiding economy offered a solution: wealth acquisition through maritime predation. This was not mindless violence, but rational actors responding to structural economic pressures through military entrepreneurship. The defensive response from Anglo-Saxon England and Carolingian Francia was hampered by fundamental institutional limitations. The military systems of both regions were designed to counter overland invasions by rival kingdoms, not to address the challenge of amphibious raiders who could strike anywhere along thousands of miles of coastline. The Fyrd system in England, a militia of a landholding freemen obligated to local defense, could not respond with sufficient speed to intercept Viking forces that appeared, struck, and vanished within hours. The technological gap between Viking and European naval capabilities was profound. While the English and Franks possessed merchant vessels and fishing boats, they lacked purpose-built warships capable of intercepting the longships. The clinker-built construction of Viking vessels, with overlapping planks providing both strength and flexibility, represented a maritime engineering achievement that would not be matched in European waters for centuries. These ships could cross the North Sea, navigate up rivers to strike inland targets, and when necessary, be portaged overland to bypass defensive fortifications. The raid economy generated its own military-industrial complex. Successful raids required not just warriors but an entire support infrastructure, shipwrights capable of constructing and maintaining the longship fleet, navigators with knowledge of coastal routes and river systems, metalworkers producing weapons and tools, and merchants capable of converting stolen, ecclesiastical treasures into usable currency through trade networks stretching from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire. By the 830s, the character of Viking operations had evolved. The hit-and-run raids of the late 8th century gave way to longer operational cycles. Raiders began overwintering in secure coastal bases, transforming seasonal raids into year-round military pressure. The establishment of long-fort fortified ship harbors in Ireland marked this transition. These were not mere raiding camps, but forward operating bases from which sustained campaigns could be launched. The strategic implications of this shift were immense. Viking forces no longer needed to return to Scandinavia between raiding seasons. They could sustain themselves through local extraction and use their fortified bases to project power across increasingly wide operational theaters. The Long Fort at Dublin, established around 841, would evolve into a permanent Scandinavian settlement and eventually a major trading hub. The raiders were becoming colonizers. The Carolingian Empire under Louis the Pious faced its own Viking crisis along the Atlantic and North Sea coasts. The Seine, Loire, and Rhine rivers became highways for Viking penetration deep into Frankish territory. In 845, a Viking force under the semi-legendary chieftain Ragnar sailed up the Seine and sacked Paris, extracting a payment of 7,000 pounds of silver in exchange for withdrawal. This was the first major Danegeld payment protection money paid to avoid destruction, a practice that would become institutionalized across Western Europe. The Danegeld system represented a perverse strategic dynamic. European rulers discovered that paying Vikings to leave was often more cost-effective than mounting expensive military campaigns with uncertain outcomes. However, this created a moral hazard problem. Successful extortion encouraged more raids. Each payment advertised European vulnerability and incentivized further Viking expeditions. The silver flowing from Frankish and English treasuries to Scandinavian chieftains fueled the expansion of the raiding economy and financed even larger military expeditions. The human cost of these early decades was catastrophic for the targeted populations. Monastic communities, the intellectual centers of early medieval Europe, were systematically destroyed. Libraries were burned, manuscripts lost, and the transmission of classical knowledge interrupted. The cultural impact was profound. Yet European society demonstrated remarkable resilience. Monasteries were rebuilt, often with improved fortifications. Stone towers became standard features, providing refuges during attacks. The Viking military system itself was evolving in response to European defensive adaptations. As coastal communities hardened targets through fortification, Viking forces developed siege capabilities. The archaeological record reveals Viking use of siege engines and mining operations against fortified positions by the mid-9th century. This was military innovation driven by operational necessity. The easy targets were disappearing, requiring more sophisticated tactical approaches. The social structure of Viking raiding parties deserves examination. These were not state-organized military expeditions, but private ventures organized by entrepreneurial chieftains. A successful raid leader would assemble a war band through a combination of kinship obligations, promises of plunder shares, and personal reputation. The longship itself functioned as both the transportation platform and the organizational unit. A typical longship carried between 30 and 60 warriors, each with a defined position and role. The combat doctrine of Viking warriors emphasized shock, action, and close-quarters violence. The primary weapons were the spear, sword, and axe, with round wooden shields providing defensive protection. Body armor was limited. Most warriors fought in leather or padded textile garments. with only the wealthiest possessing mail shirts. The tactical approach was straightforward: achieve surprise, deliver overwhelming violence at the point of contact, seize objectives quickly, and withdraw before organized resistance could form. By 850, the Viking phenomenon had fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of northwestern Europe. What began as isolated raids had evolved into a sustained military-economic system. The Northmen had demonstrated that the maritime domain provided asymmetric advantages that land-based powers could not easily counter. The defensive responses, fortifications, naval construction programs, reformed military organizations would take decades to implement effectively. The Lindisfarne shock had metastasized into a civilizational challenge. The monks who perished in 793 could not have imagined that their deaths marked the beginning of nearly 3 centuries of conflict that would reshape kingdoms, redraw political boundaries, and ultimately transform the raiders themselves from pagan predators into Christian rulers. The Viking Age was not merely a historical episode, but a crucible in which modern European political geography would be forged. The year 865 marked a categorical shift in the Viking threat matrix. The scattered raiding parties that had terrorized coastal Europe for 7 decades coalesced into something unprecedented. A unified invasion force of such magnitude that Anglo-Saxon chroniclers could only describe it as the Great Heathen Army. This was no longer economic opportunism. This was conquest. The army that landed in East Anglia represented a qualitative transformation in Viking military organization. Contemporary sources suggest a force numbering several thousand warriors, though precise figures remain contested among modern historians. What is certain is the operational scale. This was not a single warband, but a coalition of multiple Scandinavian chieftains operating under coordinated command. The logistical achievement alone was remarkable. The assembly, transportation, and sustainment of a multi-thousand-man expeditionary force across the North Sea required planning capabilities that challenged the organizational capacity of most European kingdoms. The strategic objective was unambiguous: the permanent conquest and settlement of Anglo-Saxon England. The 4 major kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, were individually wealthy but mutually antagonistic. The Vikings exploited this fragmentation with surgical precision. Their campaign plan demonstrated sophisticated understanding of English political dynamics. Rather than dispersing forces across multiple targets, the Great Army operated as a concentrated striking force, overwhelming kingdoms sequentially while exploiting their inability to coordinate unified resistance. The invasion commenced with a deception operation. The Vikings initially presented themselves to the East Anglian king as seeking winter quarters and supplies, offering payment and peaceful conduct. This was calculated misdirection. Once established and provisioned, the army moved north into Northumbria, arriving at York in November 866. The timing was exquisite. Northumbria was convulsed by civil war between rival claimants to the throne. The kingdom's military forces were divided and unprepared for external assault. The Battle of York, fought on March 21, 867, demonstrated the tactical superiority of Viking combined arms doctrine. The city's Roman walls should have provided formidable defensive advantages. However, the Northumbrian forces, attempting to recapture the city from Viking occupation, mounted a poorly coordinated assault that played directly into Viking defensive strengths. The Scandinavian warriors employed a tactic that would become their signature: the shield wall. The shield wall was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in execution. Warriors formed overlapping ranks with circular shields, creating an almost impenetrable barrier. Spears projected forward from the formation, creating a bristling hedge of points that made frontal assault suicidal. The key to the formation's effectiveness was discipline and cohesion. Each warrior's shield protected not only himself but the man to his left, creating mutual dependence that transformed individual fighters into a unified combat system. At York, the Northumbrian assault shattered against the Viking shield wall. Both rival kings Osbert and Gla died in the battle. Northumbria effectively ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. The Great Army installed a puppet ruler and converted the kingdom into a tributary state. The strategic implications were profound. The Vikings now controlled York, which became the capital of the Kingdom of Jorvik, a Scandinavian polity that would endure for nearly a century. The army's next objective was Mercia, the dominant Midland kingdom. In 867, the Vikings established a fortified base at Nottingham. The Mercian king Burgred requested assistance from his ally, Alfred of Wessex. The combined Anglo-Saxon force besieged the Viking position but proved unable to dislodge the invaders. The campaign ended in negotiated settlement. The Vikings agreed to withdraw from Mercia in exchange for substantial payments. This was not victory but purchased time. The operational pattern established by the Great Army deserves analytical attention. The Vikings were pioneering a form of mobile warfare that exploited England's river network. Their longships could penetrate deep inland via the Thames, Trent, Ouse, and other navigable waterways. This amphibious capability allowed them to bypass road networks and fortifications, striking targets that English armies could only reach through slow overland marches. The strategic mobility differential was decisive. In 869, the army returned to East Anglia. The circumstances of King Edmund's death entered legend almost immediately. According to hagiographic accounts, Edmund was captured, offered the choice of apostasy or death, and chose martyrdom. He was bound to a tree, shot with arrows, and beheaded. The historical reality was likely more prosaic: a king defeated in battle and executed as a political threat. Regardless, East Anglia was absorbed into the expanding Viking territorial confederation. By 870, 3 of England's 4 kingdoms had fallen. Only Wessex remained independent, and the Great Army now turned its full attention southward. The invasion of Wessex commenced with a winter campaign itself, a tactical innovation that caught the West Saxons unprepared. Anglo-Saxon military culture observed seasonal campaign rhythms, with armies dispersing to their estates during winter months. The Vikings recognized this institutional vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. The Battle of Ashdown, fought on January 8, 871, represented the first significant Anglo-Saxon victory against the Great Army. The engagement occurred on the Berkshire Downs, with both forces arrayed in shield wall formations. The Viking army deployed in 2 divisions, mirroring the two-king command structure they had adopted. The West Saxon forces, led by King Fellard and his younger brother Alfred, matched this deployment. The battle's turning point came when Alfred, commanding the Saxon vanguard, initiated combat before his brother's division was fully positioned. This was either tactical brilliance or a fortunate violation of battle protocol. Accounts differ. The premature engagement forced the Vikings to commit their reserves earlier than optimal, creating gaps in their formation. The West Saxon infantry exploited these openings, driving through the Viking line and inflicting heavy casualties. Ashdown demonstrated that the Great Army was not invincible. However, the strategic situation remained dire. The Vikings won the subsequent battles at Basing and Meriton, neutralizing the Ashdown victory. King Fellard died shortly after, possibly from wounds sustained in battle, and Alfred ascended to the throne in circumstances that would have broken lesser men. Wessex was in existential crisis. The year 876 brought the final Viking offensive. A new force under the chieftain Guthrum launched a winter invasion, seizing the fortress town of Wareham in Dorset. Alfred besieged the position but could not prevent a Viking relief force from arriving by sea. The resulting negotiations saw the Vikings withdraw in exchange for hostages and oaths. Both were violated within months. The Vikings broke out under cover of night, massacring the hostage guards and racing for Exeter. The Exeter campaign revealed the operational exhaustion affecting both sides. Alfred's forces maintained a loose containment of the Viking garrison, but lacked the siege capabilities to force surrender. Viking relief fleet attempting to break the blockade was destroyed by storms off the Dorset coast, a meteorological intervention that Anglo-Saxon chroniclers attributed to divine favor. Facing isolation and dwindling supplies, Guthrum negotiated another withdrawal. The final crisis arrived in January 878. Guthrum launched a surprise winter offensive, striking the royal estate at Chippenham, where Alfred was celebrating Christmas. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Alfred barely escaped with a handful of followers, fleeing into the marshlands of Somerset. Wessex appeared to have fallen. Many nobles submitted to Viking authority. The conquest of England seemed complete. Alfred's response from his refuge in the Somerset marshes represents one of history's great strategic comebacks. He established a fortified base at Atelier and began rebuilding military forces through a network of loyal thanes. The operational concept was guerrilla warfare, small unit raids against Viking foraging parties, interdiction of supply lines, and systematic harassment designed to degrade enemy combat effectiveness and morale. By May 878, Alfred had assembled sufficient forces to risk open battle. He sent word through still loyal networks for the fires of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire to muster at Egbert's Stone. The response demonstrated that Viking control of Wessex was superficial. When Alfred emerged from the marshes, he commanded an army of several thousand men. The stage was set for the decisive engagement at Edington. The Battle of Edington was fought in May 878 on the downs near the modern village of Westbury in Wiltshire. Both armies deployed in traditional shield wall formations, but the tactical dynamics favored Alfred. His forces fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland against foreign occupation. Guthrum's warriors, while experienced, were fighting for plunder and land far from their logistical bases. The battle was a grinding, close-quarters infantry engagement. Neither side possessed significant cavalry or archery components. Victory depended on the cohesion and endurance of the shield wall formations. The fighting lasted through the day. Slowly, incrementally, the Viking line began to yield ground. The breakthrough came when a section of the Viking formation fragmented under sustained pressure. West Saxon warriors poured through the gap, rolling up the flanks of the adjacent Viking units. The Viking army broke. Guthrum's forces retreated to their fortified camp at Chippenham with Alfred's forces in pursuit. The subsequent two-week siege ended with Guthrum's surrender. The terms Alfred imposed were revolutionary: baptism, territorial partition, and a formal peace treaty. The Great Army had been defeated not through annihilation but through strategic exhaustion and the imposition of political settlement. The Treaty of Wedmore formalized the partition of England into Anglo-Saxon and Viking spheres, the famous Danelaw. The boundary ran roughly along Watling Street, the old Roman road from London to Chester. Everything northeast belonged to Viking settlement. Everything southwest remained under Alfred's authority. This was not defeat for the Vikings, but transformation. The conquerors became settlers, raiders became rulers, and the military threat evolved into a geopolitical reality that would define England for generations. The Treaty of Wedmore did not end Viking military operations in England. It transformed them. The Great Heathen Army's fragmentation into settled territorial lordships created a new strategic architecture, the Danelaw. This was not a unified political entity, but rather a constellation of Scandinavian-ruled territories spanning nearly half of England. The military challenge facing Alfred and his successors shifted from repelling invasion to gradual territorial reconquest and the integration of a culturally alien population. The Danelaw itself represented a revolutionary demographic and cultural transplantation. Tens of thousands of Scandinavian settlers established farms, villages, and trading centers across East Anglia, the East Midlands, and Yorkshire. The place name evidence alone reveals the scale: settlements ending in by, farm, thorp, hamlet, and thwaite, clearing, proliferated across the landscape. These were not temporary military encampments, but permanent agricultural colonies supported by families, livestock, and the full apparatus of settled society. The military implications of this settlement pattern were complex. On one hand, Viking military potential was reduced as warriors transitioned to farmers. Raiding culture gave way to territorial defense. The Scandinavian settlers now had fixed assets to protect, which constrained their operational mobility. On the other hand, the Danelaw represented a permanent security threat embedded in the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. Any renewal of Viking aggression could draw on locally established bases rather than requiring transoceanic invasion. Alfred's strategic response was institutional innovation on a grand scale. He recognized that defeating Viking armies in battle was insufficient. Long-term security required systematic, defensive infrastructure capable of deterring raids and providing secure bases for counteroffensive operations. The solution was the burh system, a network of fortified towns strategically positioned to ensure that no location in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a defensive refuge. The burhs were more than simple forts. They were planned urban centers designed to serve multiple functions: military garrisons, administrative centers, markets, and workshops. The construction program was massive. The Burgelheidage, a document listing the defensive obligations of each region, reveals that Alfred's engineers fortified over 30 locations across Wessex. The walls of these burhs required millions of man-hours of labor and represented a mobilization of national resources, comparable to major military campaigns. The military doctrine underlying the burh system was sophisticated. Each fortification was garrisoned by a permanent rotation of furred troops drawn from surrounding districts. The size of the garrison was calculated based on the length of walls requiring defense, with the formula allocating 1 man per pole, 5.5 yards of fortification. This produced garrison sizes ranging from a few hundred to over 2,000 men for major centers like Winchester. The strategic effect was to deny Vikings their primary operational advantage: mobility and surprise. Any raiding force penetrating Wessex would find itself operating in hostile territory with fortified refuges, denying them easy plunder. Local populations could withdraw into the burhs with their portable wealth, leaving the raiders facing the prospect of costly sieges against well-defended positions. The risk-reward calculus that had made raiding profitable was fundamentally altered. Alfred complemented the fixed defenses with naval construction. Understanding that Viking longships enabled their amphibious operations, he commissioned the building of warships designed to intercept raiding fleets at sea. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that Alfred's ships were almost twice as long as Viking longships, carrying 60 oars or more. Whether these vessels were actually superior to Scandinavian craft remains debated, but the strategic intent was clear: contest Viking control of the maritime domain. The succession of Alfred's son Edward the Elder in 899 initiated a systematic campaign of territorial reconquest. Edward inherited both his father's defensive infrastructure and his strategic vision. Working in concert with his sister Thelfold, who ruled Mercia as Lady of the Mercians, Edward executed a methodical advance into the Danelaw. The operational concept was incremental, construct advance burhs to project power into Danish territory. Use these as bases for military operations and consolidate control through administrative integration. The campaign pattern was consistent. Edward would advance into Danish territory and establish a new burh, often at strategically significant locations like river crossings or Roman road junctions. The construction of these forward operating bases was itself a military operation, requiring protection of work parties against Danish counterattacks. Once completed, the burh served as a strongpoint from which surrounding Danish settlements could be brought under English authority. The Battle of Tettenhall in 910 demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach. A Viking army from Northumbria raided deep into Mercia, reaching as far as Bridgenorth on the Severn. Edward and Thelfold responded with a coordinated pincer movement, catching the Viking force laden with plunder as it withdrew. The resulting engagement was catastrophic for the raiders. The Northumbrian Viking kings Eowils and Halfdan were both killed along with much of their army. Tettenhall marked a psychological turning point. The military invincibility that had characterized Viking forces for over a century was decisively shattered. The survivors learned that deep raids into English territory now faced coordinated responses from multiple burh garrisons working in operational coordination. The strategic balance had shifted. English forces could now move through their own territory using the burh network as a logistical spine, while Viking forces operated in increasingly hostile environments. The reconquest accelerated through the 910s. By 917, Edward had pushed his authority across the East Midlands. The key to success was not single decisive battles, but sustained pressure combined with systematic fortification. Each campaign season saw new burhs established, Danish jarls submitting to English authority, and the frontier pushed northward. The Danes, fragmented into rival lordships without unified command, could not mount effective strategic resistance. Ethelflaed's contribution deserves particular emphasis. Ruling Mercia as an independent military commander, she executed her own campaign of fortification and territorial expansion. The burghs at Stafford, Tamworth, Warwick, and Derby were her constructions. Her forces captured Derby in 917, eliminating one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw. She was negotiating the surrender of York, which would have brought all of the Danelaw under English authority when she died in 918. Edward moved immediately to consolidate the gains. He assumed direct control of Mercia, ending its status as a separate kingdom. By 920, his authority extended to the Humber. The northern Danelaw, centered on York, remained under Viking control, but as an increasingly isolated Scandinavian enclave. The strategic geography had been revolutionized. England was no longer a patchwork of rival kingdoms, but an emerging unified state under West Saxon hegemony. The reign of Edward's grandson Aethelstan brought the reconquest to completion. Aethelstan succeeded to the throne in 924 with clear strategic objectives: the final subjugation of York and the projection of English military power over the entire island of Britain. His campaign against York in 927 was executed with overwhelming force. The Viking king Guthrum submitted without battle, recognizing that resistance was futile. For the first time, a single monarch ruled all of England. The Battle of Brunanburh in 937 was the military validation of this achievement. A coalition of Vikings from Dublin, Scots, and Welsh princes attempted to reverse English territorial gains. The resulting engagement was one of the largest battles fought in Britain during the early medieval period. Contemporary poetry describes a full day of savage combat. The English shield wall held against repeated assaults. By evening, the coalition was in full retreat with catastrophic casualties. Brunanburh was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic statement that the era of Viking military supremacy in Britain had ended. The English military system, the combination of burh defenses, mobile field armies, and coordinated command had proven capable of defeating the best Viking forces in open battle. The reconquest was militarily secure. However, the Danelaw's cultural legacy endured. The Scandinavian settlers had not been expelled, but integrated. They retained their language, laws, and customs under English sovereignty. This created a hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian culture that would profoundly influence English development. The legal concepts of trial by jury and local self-governance through assemblies had Scandinavian roots. The English language itself absorbed thousands of Old Norse words during this period. The military integration of the Danelaw presented both opportunities and challenges. The Scandinavian settlers provided a pool of experienced warriors who could be mobilized for English military campaigns. However, their loyalty remained contingent on effective governance and military success. Any weakness in English authority risked renewed Viking assertion of independence. The death of Ethelflaed in 939 triggered exactly this scenario. Within months, a new Viking leader Olaf Guthrum from Dublin seized York and launched campaigns to restore Scandinavian independence across the Danelaw. The fragility of English consolidation was exposed. It took nearly 2 decades of renewed warfare before York was finally and permanently integrated into the English kingdom in 954 with the expulsion of the last Viking king, Eric Bloodaxe. The Danelaw consolidation period from 878 to 954 represents a masterclass in strategic patience and systematic institutional development. Alfred and his successors understood that military victory alone was insufficient. Permanent security required demographic integration, administrative reorganization, and the construction of defensive infrastructure capable of deterring future aggression. The burh system was not merely a collection of forts, but the physical manifestation of a transformed strategic culture. The human cost of this century-long consolidation was immense. Thousands died in battles, sieges, and raids. Entire communities were displaced. Agricultural productivity was disrupted by military campaigns and the labor requirements of fortification construction. Yet the strategic achievement was undeniable. By mid-century, England had emerged as a unified, defensively organized kingdom capable of resisting external threats and projecting power beyond its borders. The Vikings had fundamentally altered England's trajectory. Their invasions destroyed the political fragmentation of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy and forced the creation of a centralized state. The military pressure they exerted drove institutional innovations that would define English governance for centuries. The raiders had become settlers, the settlers had become subjects, and England had become a kingdom forged in the crucible of sustained conflict. The relative peace that England enjoyed in the mid to late 10th century proved temporary. By 980, a new generation of Scandinavian warriors began testing English defenses with renewed raiding campaigns. These were not the settlement-oriented invasions of the Great Heathen Army, but rather a return to the economic predation model of the 8th century, though executed on a vastly larger scale and with considerably more sophisticated operational planning. The strategic context had shifted dramatically. The unified English kingdom created by Alfred's descendants presented a single, wealthy target. The burh system, while still maintained, had not been significantly upgraded in decades. Perhaps most critically, the English monarchy under Ethelred II lacked the military competence and political authority that had characterized earlier West Saxon rulers. The combination of institutional complacency and leadership failure created a vulnerability that Scandinavian chieftains were quick to exploit. The raids of the 980s began modestly but escalated rapidly. In 980, Viking forces struck Southampton and Thanet. In 982, they burned Portland. In 988, they sacked Watchet in Somerset. Each successful raid advertised English weakness and attracted additional Viking warbands seeking profit. The operational pattern was familiar from previous centuries: strike coastal targets, extract maximum portable wealth, withdraw before English forces could concentrate for effective response. What distinguished this second wave of raiding was the scale of individual operations and the coordination between different Viking fleets. By 991, the raiders were operating multi-thousand-man forces capable of engaging English armies in open battle. The Battle of Maldon in August 991 exemplified the new tactical dynamic. A Viking fleet entered the Blackwater estuary in Essex and made camp on Northey Island. The local alderman Bertnoth assembled the Essex Fyrd and confronted the raiders. The battle itself became legendary through an Old English poem composed shortly after the engagement. The tactical situation was constrained by geography. Northey Island was accessible from the mainland only via a narrow causeway, easily defended by a small force. The Vikings requested passage to the mainland for a fair fight, and Bertnoth, motivated by what the poem characterizes as overmod, a concept somewhere between pride and reckless courage, agreed. This decision was catastrophically poor tactical judgment. The causeway negated the Vikings' numerical advantage and forced them to attack through a fatal bottleneck. By granting passage, Bertnoth transformed a defensive position of overwhelming strength into a meeting engagement on relatively open ground. The Viking force deployed in their characteristic shield wall, and close-quarters combat ensued. The Battle of Maldon was decided by superior Viking combat cohesion. When Bertnoth fell killed by spear thrusts that the poem describes in graphic detail, portions of the English line broke. A corps of veteran warriors fought to the death around their lord's body in accordance with warrior culture's demands, but significant elements of the Fyrd fled. The Vikings held the field and the path to unrestricted raiding across Essex. The strategic response from Ethelred's government was to revive the Danegeld system that Alfred had worked so strenuously to eliminate. In 991, the English crown paid £10,000 of silver to the Viking fleet in exchange for a cessation of raiding. This was a catastrophic policy failure. It advertised that English resistance could be purchased away, inviting further aggression. Every subsequent payment, and there would be many, funded the expansion of Viking military capabilities while degrading English fiscal capacity. The Danegeld payments escalated remorselessly. In 994, £16,000. In 1002, £24,000. By 1012, the payment had reached £48,000 of silver. These were staggering sums. To put this in perspective, the entire annual revenue of the English crown was likely less than £70,000. The Viking raids were systematically bankrupting the kingdom while enriching, Scandinavian chieftains who could use the silver to recruit larger armies for subsequent campaigns. The cycle was vicious. Large Danegeld payments attracted more raiders, necessitating larger subsequent payments. The English crown raised the necessary silver through increasingly burdensome taxation, alienating the population and degrading military morale. Meanwhile, the Vikings discovered that they could achieve far greater returns through the threat of violence than through actual raiding. The protection racket had become industrialized. The arrival of Olaf Tryggvason and Sweyn Forkbeard in the mid-990s marked a qualitative escalation. These were not mere raiding chieftains, but kings of Norway and Denmark respectively, commanding resources that dwarfed earlier Viking expeditions. Their fleets numbered in the hundreds of ships. Their armies counted warriors in the tens of thousands. These were invasion forces operating at near state level of organizational sophistication. Æthelred's response to this existential threat was the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002 on November 13th. The king ordered the killing of all Danes in England. The actual implementation was geographically limited to the Danelaw regions with majority. Scandinavian populations were beyond royal authority to execute such orders, but the symbolic violence was immense. Among the victims was Gunhild, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard. The massacre transformed the Viking raids from economic predation into a war of conquest and revenge. Sweyn's response was systematic devastation. From 1003 onward, Danish armies campaigned across England with the explicit objective of territorial conquest. The operational pattern combined military campaigns with political subversion. Danish forces would ravage a region until the local nobility submitted and paid tribute. Sweyn was not merely raiding. He was constructing a network of client relationships that would facilitate eventual political takeover. The English military response was hampered by internal dysfunction. Æthelred's relationship with his nobility was poisonous. He suspected treason everywhere, executing or exiling powerful nobles whose military capabilities were essential for effective resistance. The resulting atmosphere of paranoid mistrust degraded command cohesion and strategic coordination. English armies took the field but operated with the tentative caution of forces led by commanders who feared their own king as much as the enemy. The appointment of Thorkel the Tall and his Jomsvikings elite, Scandinavian mercenaries to English service in 1012, represented a desperate attempt to acquire military competence. Thorkel's forces had been ravaging southern England when Æthelred bought their services with an enormous Danegeld payment plus ongoing military salaries. The irony was profound. The English crown was now paying Vikings to fight Vikings, a strategic bankruptcy made manifest. Sweyn's final invasion in 1013 met minimal resistance. His fleet sailed up the Humber and secured the submission of the Danelaw regions based on ethnic solidarity. He then marched south, receiving submissions from each region as his army advanced. Æthelred fled to Normandy. By Christmas 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard was recognized as King of England. The conquest appeared complete. Sweyn's death in February 1014 provided a temporary reprieve. His son Cnut was elected king by the Viking army, but the English nobility recalled Æthelred from exile. England was now contested between two kings, each backed by substantial military forces. The resulting civil war was devastating. Danish and English armies marched across the countryside, living off the land and leaving famine in their wake. The death of Æthelred in April 1016 did not end the conflict, but rather intensified it. His son Edmund Ironside proved to be everything his father was not: militarily competent, personally brave, and capable of inspiring loyalty. Edmund fought a series of battles against Cnut's forces across southern England. He won at Penselwood and Shurston, demonstrating that English forces could defeat the Danes in open combat when competently led. The Battle of Asandon in October 1016 was the decisive engagement. The location remains disputed, but the tactical circumstances are clear. Both armies deployed in full strength, with Edmund commanding the English forces and Cnut the Danes. The battle was a grinding infantry engagement, shield wall against shield wall. Contemporary accounts describe fighting that lasted through the entire day. The battle turned on betrayal. Edric Striana, an English alderman of dubious loyalty who had defected between sides multiple times, commanded a significant portion of Edmund's forces. At a critical moment in the battle, Edric's contingent withdrew from the field. Whether this was prearranged treachery or battlefield panic remains debated. The effect was catastrophic. The gap in the English line allowed Danish forces to roll up the exposed flanks. The English army broke. Edmund survived the battle, but was forced to negotiate a partition of the kingdom. He would rule Wessex. Cnut would take the rest. This arrangement lasted mere weeks. Edmund died in November 1016 under circumstances that prompted immediate suspicion of assassination. With his death, Cnut became sole king of England. The Second Viking Age had culminated in the complete conquest that had eluded even the Great Heathen Army. Cnut's accession to the English throne in 1016 represented a geopolitical earthquake. For the first time, a Scandinavian monarch ruled England, not as a conqueror maintaining military occupation, but as a legitimate king working within the existing constitutional and administrative frameworks of Anglo-Saxon governance. The transformation from Viking raider to Christian monarch was complete. The strategic implications extended far beyond England itself. Cnut inherited a devastated kingdom. 2 decades of warfare had disrupted agricultural production, destroyed infrastructure, and depleted the treasury. The population was exhausted and traumatized. Any conventional conquest would have maintained military occupation and extracted wealth through systematic exploitation. Cnut chose a different path. He recognized that long-term security and prosperity required reconciliation with the English, nobility, and the integration of Danish and English political cultures. The military challenge Cnut faced was maintaining control with a relatively small Danish army in a kingdom where the population was overwhelmingly English. The solution was political rather than martial. Cnut systematically incorporated English nobles into his government, appointed English bishops, and made lavish donations to English churches and monasteries. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of Felard II, providing dynastic continuity and legitimacy. These were calculated moves designed to transform military conquest into political stability. The housecarl system was Cnut's primary military innovation. These were professional warriors maintained on permanent royal salary, forming a standing military force of unparalleled quality. Unlike the Fyrd, which consisted of part-time militia serving temporary rotations, the housecarls were full-time soldiers whose entire identity and economic security derived from military service. They provided Cnut with a rapid reaction force capable of suppressing internal rebellions and deterring external threats. The housecarls were equipped to elite standards. They wore mail shirts, carried large two-handed axes capable of cleaving through shield and armor alike, and trained continuously in formation combat. Their tactical doctrine emphasized offensive shock action. Where earlier Viking warriors had relied on shield wall defense, the housecarls were trained to break enemy formations through overwhelming violence at the point of contact. They represented the cutting edge of early medieval military technology. Cnut's strategic vision extended beyond England. He inherited claims to the Danish throne from his father and the Norwegian throne through conquest. By 1028, he had assembled what historians term the North Sea Empire, a confederation of kingdoms including England, Denmark, and Norway, united under his personal rule. This was not a centralized state, but rather a collection of territories, each governed according to local custom and law, bound together by dynastic ties and military power. The strategic advantages of the North Sea Empire were substantial. Cnut could draw military resources from multiple kingdoms, using English wealth to fund Scandinavian military operations and Scandinavian warriors to maintain English security. The empire controlled the critical maritime trade routes linking the Baltic, North Sea, and Atlantic trading zones. This generated enormous customs revenue while providing strategic leverage over regional commerce. Maintaining the empire required constant military and diplomatic activity. Norway, in particular, was fractious and resistant to external rule. Cnut campaigned there personally in 1028 to secure submission from Norwegian nobles. The operation was executed with overwhelming force. Cnut assembled a fleet that contemporary sources numbered at 50 ships carrying thousands of warriors. The Norwegian nobles, recognizing that resistance was futile, submitted without major combat. The ecclesiastical dimension of Cnut's rule deserves emphasis. He positioned himself as a Christian monarch of exceptional piety, making a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 to attend the coronation of Emperor Conrad II. This was not merely religious devotion but strategic theater. The pilgrimage advertised Cnut's legitimacy to the broader Christian community and established diplomatic relationships with continental powers. He returned with reduced tolls for English merchants traveling to Rome and prestige that enhanced his authority across the empire. The military threat from Scandinavia that had defined English strategic planning for 2 centuries effectively ceased under Cnut's rule. The raiders and the raided were now governed by the same monarch. This allowed a dramatic reduction in defensive expenditures. The burh garrisons could be reduced, and the massive Danegeld payments that had bankrupted Ethelred's government were redirected to more productive purposes. The English economy experienced a recovery that contemporary sources describe as unprecedented prosperity. However, the empire's unity depended entirely on Cnut's personal authority and military competence. There was no institutional mechanism to preserve the confederation after his death. The succession arrangements were complex and ultimately unstable. Cnut had sons by 2 different wives, Svein and Harold Harefoot by his first wife Glufgefu, and Harthacnut by Emma of Normandy. The potential for succession conflict was obvious. Cnut died in 1035 at approximately 40 years of age. The empire immediately fragmented. Harold Harefoot seized control of England while Harthacnut was occupied securing his position in Denmark. The succession dispute was resolved by Harold's death in 1040. Allowing Harthacnut to claim the English throne, but the damage to the empire's structural integrity was irreversible. Norway broke away under native rulers. The North Sea Empire proved to be a personal achievement rather than a lasting political structure. Harthacnut's brief reign from 1040 to 1042 was characterized by unpopular taxation and political instability. He died suddenly in 1042 at a wedding feast, possibly poisoned, though natural causes are equally plausible. With his death, the male line of Cnut's dynasty was extinct. The English nobility recalled Edward, son of Ethelred II and Emma of Normandy, from exile in Normandy. The Viking conquest of England ended not with military defeat but with the extinction of the dynasty. The strategic legacy of Cnut's North Sea Empire was profound despite its brief duration. It demonstrated that England could be successfully integrated into a broader Scandinavian political sphere. It proved that Danish and English political cultures were compatible under competent leadership. The year 1066 stands as the most analyzed date in English history, and with good reason. It was the year in which the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, forged in the crucible of Viking invasion and consolidated through centuries of conflict, faced simultaneous invasions from Norway and Normandy. The military campaigns of that year represent the culmination and conclusion of the Viking Age in Britain. The battles fought would determine not just the English crown, but the entire trajectory of European political development. Edward the Confessor died on January 5, 1066, without a direct heir. His death triggered a succession crisis of extraordinary complexity. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex and the most powerful noble in England, was elected king by the Witan on the day of Edward's death. His claim was based on English election and alleged deathbed designation by Edward. However, 2 other claimants rejected this succession. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, claimed the throne through convoluted genealogical arguments tracing back to Cnut. Harald Hardrada represented the final flowering of Viking military culture. He was a warrior of legendary status, having served in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire before returning to claim the Norwegian throne. His military experience spanned the Mediterranean to the Arctic. Contemporary sources describe him as exceptionally tall, over 6 feet, in an era when average male height was perhaps 5 feet 6 inches, and possessed of tactical brilliance honed through decades of combat. The Norwegian invasion force that assembled in summer 1066 was massive by any standard. Hardrada commanded a fleet estimated at 300 longships carrying perhaps 10 to 15,000 warriors. This was not a raiding party, but an army of conquest comparable to the Great Heathen Army 2 centuries earlier. The operational plan was to sail to England, secure the submission of the Danelaw regions through ethnic appeals, and then march south to claim the throne. The invasion commenced in September 1066. Hardrada's fleet sailed to the Orkney Islands, then down the English coast to the Humber estuary. The initial operations achieved complete success. The Norwegian army landed and marched inland, engaging the northern English forces at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th. The English army, commanded by the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, deployed in a defensive position near the city of York. Fulford was a tactical disaster for the English. The battle was fought on marshy ground near the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss. The English deployed with their flanks protected by water and marsh, creating a strong defensive position. However, Hardrada executed a feigned retreat that drew the English forces out of position. Once the English line was extended and disordered, the Norwegian reserves counterattacked, rolling up the exposed flanks. The English army broke with heavy casualties. York negotiated immediate surrender. Harold Godwinson received news of the Norwegian invasion while in southern England preparing to resist William's expected invasion from Normandy. His response demonstrated both strategic clarity and operational brilliance. He immediately force-marched his army north a distance of nearly 200 miles, covering the ground in approximately 4 days. This was a logistical achievement of extraordinary difficulty. Maintaining unit cohesion while moving thousands of men at forced march pace required planning and discipline of the highest order. Harold arrived at Tadcaster 9 miles from York on September 24th. The Norwegians were unprepared for his arrival. Hardrada had divided his forces, leaving a substantial portion guarding his fleet at Rickle while he and the main army occupied Stamford Bridge. 7 miles east of York, the position at Stamford Bridge was tactically poor, a river crossing without significant defensive fortifications. The Norwegians expected no immediate threat and had not deployed for combat. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, was decided by Harold's achievement of complete strategic surprise. The English army approached from the west along the Roman road, arriving at the bridge before the Norwegians had organized effective resistance. The initial English assault crossed the bridge and established a bridgehead on the eastern bank. The fighting was chaotic and brutal. Norwegian forces fought in scattered groups without coordinated command. The legendary account of a single Norwegian warrior holding the bridge against the entire English army, allegedly killing 40 English soldiers before being killed when an English soldier floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the wooden planks, may be apocryphal. However, it reflects the desperate character of the early fighting. The Norwegians were attempting to buy time for their scattered forces to assemble into proper battle formation. Hardrada personally led the formation of a defensive shield wall east of the bridge. This was traditional Viking tactical doctrine: create an impenetrable wall of overlapping shields and await the enemy assault. Against a disordered enemy or one suffering from poor morale, the shield wall was devastatingly effective. Against Harold's veteran housecarls and furred soldiers, it proved insufficient. The English assault on the Norwegian shield wall was methodical and relentless. Waves of infantry attacked the formation, attempting to break its cohesion through sustained pressure. Archery played a significant role. Arrows arcing over the shield wall inflicted casualties on warriors in the rear ranks who lacked overhead protection. The attrition was gradual but cumulative. Hardrada himself was struck in the throat by an arrow and killed. The death of Hardrada should have ended Norwegian resistance. However, Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother, who had allied with the Norwegians, assumed command and rallied the surviving forces. Additionally, Norwegian reinforcements arrived from the fleet at Rickle. These fresh troops, led by Eystein Orr, counterattacked with such ferocity that they temporarily drove back the English line. Contemporary sources refer to this phase as Orr's Storm. Did you know the Viking Age didn't just fade away? It ended in a blaze of glory and betrayal, all in one crazy year, 1066. It all started with the Norwegian Vikings, led by King Harald Hardrada, who thought he had a claim to the English throne. They landed in the north of England and actually won their first battle. Things were looking good. But the English king, Harold Godwinson, was no slouch. He force-marched his army nearly 200 miles in just 4 days. Can you imagine? The Norwegians were caught completely off guard at a place called Stamford Bridge. They were relaxing, many without their armor, not expecting a fight. The English army smashed into them. Hardrada himself, the last great Viking king, fell in the fighting and his army was annihilated. It was a massive victory for England, but it came at a huge cost. Their army was battered, exhausted, and far from home. And here's the twist. Just 3 days later, another claimant to the throne, William of Normandy, landed his army on the southern coast of England. Now, here's the kicker. William was a descendant of Vikings himself. The Normans were basically French-eyed Vikings. King Harold had to turn his exhausted army around and march another 250 miles south to face this new threat. This all led to the legendary Battle of Hastings. The English, weary from their previous march and battle, fought bravely all day on a hilltop. But as evening fell, a stray arrow supposedly struck King Harold in the eye, and the English line broke. William, soon to be known as William the Conqueror, won the day. With Harold Godwinson dead and the English army defeated, the Viking Age in England was officially over. The era of raids and longships gave way to Norman castles and a new kind of rule. It wasn't that the Vikings disappeared. They just evolved. William the Conqueror's victory ushered in a new chapter for England, forever shaped by its Viking and Norman heritage. So, 1066 wasn't just an end, but a spectacular and violent beginning of something new. Thanks for watching. If you love digging into these epic historical moments, make sure to like and subscribe for more. See you next time. The period from 793 to 1066 witnessed the transformation of Europe's political geography through Scandinavian military pressure, the raids that began with isolated longships striking undefended monasteries evolved into state-level invasions commanding fleets of hundreds of ships. The raiders became settlers, the settlers became rulers, and the rulers became the ancestors of European aristocracy. The defensive responses to Viking aggression fortified burhs, standing armies, centralized royal administration created the institutional foundations of the modern state. The military legacy is equally profound. Viking tactical innovations, the shield wall, the amphibious assault, the strategic use of river navigation for operational mobility influenced European military practice for centuries. The longship itself remained the dominant warship design in northern waters until the development of the cog in the 12th century. The professional warrior culture of the housecarls became the template for feudal military organization. The human cost across nearly 3 centuries defies comprehensive calculation. Tens of thousands died in battles and raids. Entire communities were destroyed or displaced. Agricultural economies were disrupted. Cultural treasures were lost. Yet this sustained military pressure also drove innovation, state formation, and ultimately the consolidation of European political power. The Vikings were not merely destroyers but catalysts of historical transformation. The Viking Age was a crucible in which modern Europe was forged through fire and blood. What began as economic opportunism by Scandinavian raiders evolved into a sustained military cultural phenomenon that reshaped the political geography of an entire continent. The transformation was comprehensive, political boundaries redrawn, kingdoms destroyed and created, populations displaced and integrated, military doctrines revolutionized. The strategic lessons remain relevant. The Vikings demonstrated that asymmetric advantages in their case. Maritime mobility and amphibious capability can allow smaller forces to impose sustained pressure on larger, wealthier adversaries. They proved that tactical innovation, when combined with operational flexibility, can offset numerical and economic disadvantages. They showed that conquest is ultimately secured not through military victory alone, but through political integration and cultural adaptation. The Northmen came as raiders and left as rulers. The kingdoms they forged and the bloodlines they established shaped European history for centuries after their longships ceased to terrorize Christian shores. Their legacy is written not just in the sagas and chronicles, but in the very DNA of European civilization in language, law, political institutions, and military culture. The canvas is complete. The strategic masterpiece painted in blood from Lindisfarne to Hastings stands as testament to human adaptability, military innovation, and the transformative power of sustained conflict. This was not merely war, but the art of history itself, executed with brutal precision across 2.5 centuries. This is the craft we practice at War Atelier, the surgical dissection of history's greatest conflicts, presented with the analytical precision they deserve. If this deep dive into Viking strategy and the birth of nations through military pressure resonates with you, then you understand what we're building here. Subscribe to War Atelier for more high-definition historical analysis where strategy meets scholarship. Hit the notification bell. This is military history presented as intellectual architecture, not entertainment. Share this work with those who appreciate warfare analyzed as art and science combined. We're constructing a library of conflict, one meticulously researched campaign at a time. Your engagement shapes what we examine next. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What strategic lessons from the Viking Age still apply to modern conflict? How did Scandinavian military culture permanently alter European development? This is War Atelier. The battlefield is our canvas, strategy is our medium, history is our masterpiece. Welcome to the Atelier.